Well, hello gang, welcome back once again to The Long Dark. I'm Lonelywolf, and here we are once again with another guide video. As you can tell by the title, we're going to be discussing clothing in The Long Dark. Some of you perhaps are wondering why this might be a needed guide, and others are probably asking why it took so long to make it. Stick around and maybe both of those questions will get answered. So, to start off with, clothing is an often underlooked or overlooked mechanic set in The Long Dark, especially for new players. This is because the game pits you with much more important problems or concerns to start out with and leaves the rest up to you. Most new players will just swap into the warmest gear, and for most intents and purposes, this is not a bad line of thinking to operate under, as cold temperatures kill you the fastest, or at least they'll do so if you never die to wildlife. However, clothing is actually a far more nuanced system than just what the warmest item is. In this guide, we're going to dive in and find out why. First up, we have the clothing slots. Most items you can wear in the Long Dark come with an inner and outer slot, with the exception of footwear, i.e. outer footwear like boots and shoes, and your hands. This is the first layer of the knot that is in the clothing mechanics, the inner and outer sets. Each piece of clothing has different stats that define how it performs, and some of these are ignored depending on if they are in the inner slot or not. So because of this reason, it's important to know which slot, inner or outer, you wear it in to know what stats will stick. With that in mind, let's discuss the variables clothing items have. First up, and most importantly, you have the warmth of the item in question. This is how much cold the clothing item will offset. This metric is not affected by being placed in the inner or outer slot. So if all your clothing combined gives you a temperature bonus of 10 degrees, and it is 20 degrees outside, your feels like temperature, sans any debuffs like wind chill, would be 30 degrees. Next up, we have the windproof value. This value is the amount of wind chill the item in question will negate. This value does not positively contribute to your feels like temperature under any normal conditions. However, if the wind is blowing and you are experiencing wind chill, it will negate a certain amount of it. So, for example, if you have a negative 5 degree wind chill and your cumulative wind chill bonus is 15 degrees, you will experience no wind chill, but your feels like will not be increased at all. That temperature that is listed in the windproof only negates wind chill, does not add anything to your warmth value. If your cumulative wind chill bonus is less than the total wind chill, that amount is deducted from the total wind chill. For example, if the wind chill is negative 20 degrees, and your clothes grant a 15 degree bonus to wind chill, you will only experience a negative 5 degree loss to your feels like temperature. Wind chill is only calculated by the outer layer of clothes. Inner layers do not contribute to this metric. For this reason, it's a good idea, if you have the clothes to do this with and you are in a windy place, to place the highest wind chill value clothes on all of the outer layers. Next up, we have the waterproofness stat. This affects how quickly the item in question becomes wet. Clothing wetness is a mechanic that increases the weight of the item being worn and decreases its warmth stats the wetter it gets. If an outer layer gets completely wet, then the second layer begins to get wet too. Once 100% wet, clothing will begin to freeze, and once frozen, clothing loses all warmth bonuses and becomes very heavy, and is also a source of frostbite if you do not thaw out and dry out the clothing. The waterproofness stat defines this item's resistance to gaining wetness, which you will find by walking through waterfalls, being outside when it's snowing, etc. Next up is protection. Protection reduces incoming damage to the player, reducing the quantity and severity of it from falls, wildlife attacks, and burns. It does not help prevent sprains from walking on steep ground. Only the outer layer is calculated for this bonus. For this reason, if you want to avoid injuries from wildlife attacks, it's a good idea to fully populate the outer slots of clothing with only the highest of protection percentage clothing. Again, only the outer layer counts for hits. Next up, we have not a buff, but a debuff, and this is the mobility penalty. Most clothing items in the Long Dark carry a mobility penalty. This is a percentage that will be taken out of your sprint meter by wearing the item. This is a fully cumulative total of all clothing items currently being worn. This means that if you have the warmth to spare, it's a good idea to run around with as few possible items of clothing, or to prioritize those with low mobility penalties to keep your sprint bar as full as possible. Note that this metric does not affect your ability to climb ropes, which means even with clothing that heavily reduces your sprinting capability, you'll still be able to go mountain climbing with ease. And finally, we have the weight of clothing. This metric, as with all items in the long dark, is one that fills up your backpack carry capacity. Worn clothing items get a reduction in total weight, meaning wearing a full set of clothes, or carrying a full set of clothes is heavier than just wearing them. By wearing that item, you reduce the total weight taken up in your backpack. Each item has a different weight, which means it also has a ratio of weight per warmth offered. For those who aren't suffering from being cold all the time, read not interloper players, it's possible to use this metric to get the most warmth out of the least amount of weight if you look at clothes that offer the most warmth for the least amount of weight. And let's get some final notes in on clothing. So, as we mentioned before, the protection bonus on clothing really shows up when you get involved in wolf struggles. You will notice that wearing a set of clothing with a high protection ratio will land you with far fewer injuries during a wolf struggle. This makes prioritizing high percentage protection items a must if you suffer from wolf struggles often, or are just trying to reduce the damage in case you do get involved in one. Clothing also loses its warmth as it degrades. This means it's paramount to keep your clothing in tip-top shape. However, you do not want to waste materials, which are finite, except for beachcombing, while doing so. A good rule of thumb is to simply let the clothing item in question deteriorate to about 60 to 70% condition, and then repair it, as your mending skill means that any major clothing item will receive at max a 30% condition increase from a repair until your mending skill is highly increased. Some smaller items, like mittens or ear wraps, can get a larger increase than 30%, however. So, this is a basic overview of clothing in the long dark. And generally speaking, warmth is probably your primary factor when looking at clothes, and stacking up with the warmest clothing items is usually the best idea. However, it can definitely pay to have a look at some of the different stats that show up on clothing, and place them in either the inner or the outer slot, depending on those stats, to maximize the benefit you get out of them. It's also a good idea to keep in mind that any clothes you're not wearing can be broken down into cloth to keep the clothes you do wear in good condition. This can be an excellent source of cloth. And as a final note, sometimes it's also a good idea to keep a few spare items of clothes you wear hanging about just in case one of yours gets ruined in a wolf or bear struggle. So for example, if you wear a wool toque, it might be a good idea to keep a spare one at your base of operations just in case yours gets destroyed.
This stuff will come in handy.
And that just about covers it for clothing. If you guys have any other items you'd like to bring about to have a guide made, or any other comments in relating to clothes, go ahead and leave those in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. As always, I hope you guys did enjoy, stay safe, and stay warm out there.